These are photographs that were provided by Kathy Kelly when she was in Afghanistan many times. And also the ones from the US military were provided by Danny Sjursen. We'll be starting in just a few moments, but we wanted you to see some of the photographs from the country we're speaking about. Okay, Greta, thank you. Let's go ahead with our program. Welcome to our webinar on ending the war on Afghanistan. We thank Veterans for Peace New York City chapter and Tarek Koff for this idea, and for David Swanson and Greta Zara for World Beyond War for helping us put this together. My name is Ann Wright. I'm a retired Army colonel and a former US diplomat. I helped reopen the embassy in Afghanistan in December of 2001 and stayed there for about 5 months, and then ended up going on to Mongolia and resigning from the government in opposition to the war in Iraq in 2003. Why are we having this webinar now? Well, the Trump administration announced just a few days ago that the US will reduce its troop strength from 4,500 to around 2,200 by Christmas. And that announcement has caused a big backlash from members of Congress and reportedly from the ranks of senior leadership of the US military, although the Secretary of Defense has not pushed back from it. And this is even though Trump has been stating that he was going to reduce troop strength in Afghanistan for many years. The administration also announced a troop drawdown in Iraq to under 3,000, and also the removal of 700 US troops from Somalia. Tomorrow, on Friday, the House Foreign Affairs Committee will hold a hearing at 9 a.m. on the US military mission in Afghanistan and implications on the peace process on US involvement. We're going to put a link in the chat to this hearing because it's very important that we weigh in with our Congress. And in fact, we urge you to call and email your members of Congress to support the end of the war on Afghanistan and the removal of US military and contractors. And also, please sign the Roots Action petition that will go to your congresspersons. We'll put that link in the chat also. Please put any questions that you have in the chat and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. And you can also raise your hand and we'll try to get to those raised hands at the end of the presentations. Today we have 5 panelists who have spent time in Afghanistan. One is from Afghanistan. 2 have been there with the US military and 1 with the Department of State, and the 1 as a US citizen, as a non-combatant. I will introduce each one of them right before they speak. You know, it's been 19, almost 20 years ago that US personnel arrived in Afghanistan in October of 2001. Since then, over the past 19 years, more than at least 43,000 Afghan civilians, and that's a low figure, I think. More than 60,000 Afghan security forces and 67,000 Taliban have been killed. There have been 2,420 US military that have been killed, and coalition forces, including the US military, 3,500. We know that there's a lot of controversy. In fact, the Australian government just yesterday announced that they will be prosecuting 19 members of their military for their actions of killing 39 civilians in Afghanistan over the years. So there are a lot of questions that we have. And to help us answer some of those questions, our first speaker is from Afghanistan. He is Arash Azizzada. He's a filmmaker, a journalist, and a community organizer living in Washington, D.C. He's the son of refugees who fled Afghanistan in the wake of the Soviet invasion and then lived in many, many, many countries before he arrived here in the United States as a refugee in August of 2001. So you can imagine that his life after September 11th, 2001 was very difficult. Arash is deeply involved in organizing and mobilizing the Afghan American community, and he co-founded the Afghan Diaspora for Equity and Progress, the first organization of its kind in the Afghan American community. And it raises awareness of social injustice and trains and empowers change makers to tackle issues from environmental racism to voter access. This last year, he's really been focusing on trying to end the war in Afghanistan and raising up the voices of women and others marginalized in Afghanistan as peace talks and reconciliation efforts take shape. Arash, we're really pleased to have you with us. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks for all the esteemed panelists and all the folks who've joined us on this Thursday night. Thanks to World Beyond War and Roots Action, Middle East Crisis Response, and I see some of my friends from Veterans for Peace are here as well. I will speak tonight, and I'll start with my own experience. Both my parents are from Afghanistan. Both are born in Kabul, in the capital city. But I myself was born in Western Europe. I am a product of displacement, and I consider myself one of the lucky ones. I currently live in the comfort of my apartment in Washington, D.C., steadily employed even amidst the global pandemic. I did not spend time in a refugee camp. I did not have to risk my life on a boat and try to make it to a Greek island and don't walk all the way to Eastern Europe or Western Europe. I did not have to stay behind in Afghanistan. I was not maimed by a landmine left behind by the Soviets. I do not have PTSD from when warlords rained rockets indiscriminately over Kabul in the mid-90s and in the civil war that ensued after. I did not lose a family member to one of the Taliban's indiscriminately dastardly attacks. And I did not stay up at night and wonder if the sound I heard over my house was that of an American drone ready to fire into our house. I did not lose Hazara and Shia friends to ISIS attacks. And yet, conflict is what has yet defined me the most as a human being. I'm 33 years old. Almost a full two decades of those were spent watching administration after administration of both parties, justifying the occupation of my homeland, Afghanistan. But Americans' involvement stretches beyond my own life. The United States has been heavily involved in the shaping of conflict there for the past 4 decades, even predating the Soviet invasion in late December of 1979. Americans' involvement in Afghanistan predates my father fleeing on a plane full of journalists and Westerners that same December, and it predates my mother's refugee path that took her from Pakistan, France, the Netherlands, and eventually to the United States. I'm currently a community organizer in the Afghan diaspora, mostly here in the United States. And for a while, I ignored the situation in my homeland. I think there was just a strong feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. Afghanistan seemed way too far away, and the situation made me feel powerless to change anything. That's what I spent roughly 20 years of my life thinking about. That's how I thought about Afghanistan. And I kept thinking these policy makers here in Washington, D.C., they don't care for me as I was going to school here in Northern Virginia. And I don't have the ear. The war machine is too powerful, and there are too many vested interests in this country who want this conflict to not end and for peace to come to Afghanistan. But roughly 2 years ago, something drastically changed for me, and that was that a women's group from Afghanistan visited this nation's capital, and they reached out to me and they said, "We're scared. The Americans are abandoning Afghanistan. They're going to cut and run. We are scared. We don't know what to do." And they essentially told me and some others in our community, "We need your help." And so I visited Afghanistan in the winter of last year and firsthand saw a country full of hope and promise. And that hope and promise, as beautiful as it was, is fleeting because death and destruction is seemingly staring around the corner for every Afghan in every corner of the country. Furthermore, I saw a corrupt Afghan power structure that empowers human rights abusers and murderers. I saw a government beholden to American power. The American empire stretches from DC to Kabul and beyond. Its foreign aid is a colonial era tool to keep the weak central government in Kabul with enough power to serve America's so-called security interests, but not to grow sovereign enough to resist it in any meaningful way. The structures that oppress our Black friends, family, and neighbors here are also oppressing our Afghan friends, family, and neighbors over there. The Humvees that were in Helmand province were prominently featured in downtown Washington, D.C. to clamp down a social movement just a few months ago. Ironically, the powers that be in D.C. cut $1 billion in aid to the Afghan government this past spring because it failed to settle an election dispute. And that same powers to be are currently engaged in election dispute of their own. And in Afghanistan, no one has clean hands, certainly not the Taliban, certainly not ISIS or Daesh, certainly not the American military or the government of Afghanistan or any NATO powers or the Australian government. Today's report by the Australian government on the impunity with which Australian special forces acted just reinforces this point. It was odd to spend most of my lifetime listening to folks in the West describe my people as backwards and savage and just prone to conflict, when it was in fact these so-called elite soldiers that were in fact the savage ones. Sadly, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of human rights abusers that have harmed the Afghan people. And unfortunately, the Afghan government itself is complicit in this. War is ugly. War makes everyone complicit. And in the end, there are no good guys. There are no brave warriors. When I went to Afghanistan, I merely saw victims. I saw dead people. I saw the injured, and then I saw those who survived and fled and who still had hope despite what they had seen. I think therefore it's of the utmost importance that we work towards the end of a project that has failed for 19 continuous years. I was in the 8th grade in middle school when we invaded Afghanistan. Here we are 2 decades later. America and NATO's military involvement in Afghanistan must end, in my eyes, as soon as possible. And I think that much is obvious to the rest of the world as well. Americans deserve better, and more importantly, Afghans deserve better. They are on the front line suffering and continue to do so. It's, however, not as simple as that. I would like to note Americans' responsibility here because it predates any specific administration, be they Democrat or Republican. This responsibility goes back past 9/11, goes back to the mid-1970s when America engaged in a proxy war with the Soviet Union and used Afghanistan as its playing field. Americans sent my Mujahideen uncle Stinger missiles and AK-47 because it served America's interest at a time. Then when America lost interest, it abandoned us until it returned to us in September and October of 2001. America is on the verge of abandoning the Afghan people again, but America and the West bear big time responsibility here. It owes us a debt. It owes us reparation for the harm done, for the abandonment that they have done in the past. America owes us peace. America owes the Afghan people a responsible pullout. And while some might use the phrase to prolong a 19-old war for another 19 years, I have to be honest here and caution that a pullout that is done as hastily as the current administration is attempting will only further harm the Afghan people. It will harm the Afghan women, minorities, specifically the Shia, Hazara, and Sikh communities, the youth of Afghanistan, the disabled, of which there are many. These are the most vulnerable who have the most at stake. A pullout that empowers the Taliban and other extremist factions can do an extraordinary amount of harm beyond the harm that America has already done so in Afghanistan. I compare the relationship between Afghanistan and America as an abusive relationship. America is Afghanistan's abusive partner for not just 2 decades, but for 4. They have kids together. There's a codependency. Alleviating that abuse and walking away is not the answer, but there is harm reduction, something that resembles transformative justice. That kind of justice requires diligent and complex work. And I'm here today not just channeling my own thoughts and fears. These are the fears and anxieties of everyday Afghans that I talk to on WhatsApp and on Zoom and on FaceTime and Skype in the past few months. They fear what is next in Afghanistan, that the next day become worse. I'd like to caution everyone, things can get worse, and they will if America continues this haphazard policy in Afghanistan. I'd like to use my time as well to show the impact of war this has had on real Afghans. So what follows next is a 3-minute clip from a very nice gentleman named Akhtar, who's been the victim of conflict and war and American occupation. He's currently internally displaced Afghan man, and he lives with his family right outside of Kabul. And so stand by as I try to share my screen here.
د جنگ دغه ګټه موږ ته رسېدلی دی چې د ځای نه خلاص شو، د تعلیم د بچو نه خلاص شو، د زوبل شم، زخمی یم، په دې سترګه لګېدلی یم، دلته پارچه وه، په دې لاس لګېدلی یم، په دې ملا لګېدلی یم، پارچه اوسه پورې پارچې پکې شته دی. نو دغه ګټې ما ته رسېدلي دي. د بچیو د تعلیم نه خلاص یم. دا د جنگ ګټه ده موږ ته. داسې خواخوږی پیدا نه شو چې دغه بچي زمونږ یو مدرسه، یو مکتب، یو کلینیک چې د دې ګټو نه ټول نه موږ خلاصي. دغه جنګ موږ ته ټول تاوان دی. هېڅ ګټه موږ د جنګ نه ونه لیده، خو پروردګار دې سوله نور راولي، باقي مانده دې خدای خیر راپېښ. موږ چې کله د پاکستان نه بېرته رالو، زموږ وطن کې موږ سوله راله، خوشحالي راله. موږ رالو دلته کلي ته، د کلي نه چې وکته چې حالات خراب و، د طالب او د امریکې جنګ و، بس هغه ځای نه هم راوتښتېدو. دغلته اوس اوسېږو، دغلته د جونګړو کې شپې سبا کوو، پراته نو د خدای هیلې ته. د جنګ دغه تاوانونه موږ ته رسېدلي دي. دې ځای نه چې هجرت کړی دی، مال حال هر څه پاتې دي. د شپې وتي، پیاده په غرونو کې مزل کړی. دغه تاوانونه ټول تاوانونه دي. بچیم د تعلیم نه ووته، بې سرنوشته شو، بچیم سختې بدو ورځې ټولې لیدلې دي. زه خپله پکې دا د زخمي شوی یم، په دې سترګه لګېدلی یم، په دې لاس لګېدلی یم، په دې ملا لګېدلی یم. دغه ټول د جنګ تاوان دی موږ ته. او به د دې کسب نه پاتې یم، کسب نه په دې پاتې یم چې بار نشم وتی، او حالات ډېر خراب دی. دغه ټول تاوانونه دی د جنګ موږ ته. موږ ته د جنګ څه ګټه نه ده رسېدلې، او نه هم پکې ګټه کړې، تاوان هم پکې کړی دی او ګټه هم پکې نه دی لیدلی. امریکایان راتګ ته دلته چې راغله، موږ ته ډېر ضررونه ورسېده، ډېر نقصانونه موږ وکړه. موږ په دې نقصان وکړه که په یو کلي باندې سم شو، یو د کور نه یو کس یې وویشتلو، نو د بسته د کورنۍ د قوم د فامیل نه خلک راوچت شو په نوم د جهاد. افغانان دي که نه، پښتو خپله ترسره کوي. نو دغې ته راپاسېد، نور هم ګډوډي زیاته شوه، هغه خپل انتقام واخله. او دی خو بېچارهګان بې سلا او بې وسله وو، څه ورسره نه وو، بس په تش لاس ورسره افغانان دي جنګېدل. خو هغه د انتقام د لاسه داسې شو چې افغانان ډېر وځپل شو بېچارهګان. امریکې راتلل دلته چې پاتې شول، ډېر موږ ته تاوان نقصان ورسېده. په دې چې خلک ټول جذبې کې شو، څه ګټه ونه رسېده، سهله رانغله، او خلک ډېر وځپل شو، شهیدان یې ورکړه، په کورونو بمباریانې وشوې، ژوندي خلک ښخ شو په ځمکه. نو دا خو موږ ته خو هېڅ ګټه ونه رسېده، دا خو موږ ته ټول تاوان دی.
So that was a gentleman who now lives with his family right outside of Kabul, who's displaced, and he spoke about the American occupation and the effects of it. And so I'd like to close my remarks and say Afghanistan is oft forgotten, does not come up in presidential debates. It doesn't make a front page of any of the newspapers anymore. And many Americans seem not to care about a war that continues to rage and continues to even kill Americans, but mostly thousands of Afghans every year. Speaking to you in front of today, though, despair gives way for hope, because that's the hope that I saw in the Afghan people, despite everything they have seen. Hope for peace continues to be the largest moving bloc in Afghanistan. Every day, Afghans, both inside and outside the country, dream of a day with no occupation, no conflict, no war, no more deaths, but an Afghanistan that is stable and where folks can continue to make their dreams come true. I'm also touched that non-Afghans join us today who care about bringing peace to Afghanistan, especially former first service members who firsthand know the devastation, the pain that conflict brings. I hope that today this conversation moves us one step further towards bringing peace to Afghanistan. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Arash. We appreciate very much your remarks, and I know that you're going to get some questions about the issue of how the 4,500 going down to 2,200 US military will actually benefit Afghanistan versus not continuing the problems there. But we'll wait for those questions to the Q&A. Next, we have a good friend, Kathy Kelly. Kathy's the founder of Voices in the Wilderness and co-coordinator of the Voices for Creative Nonviolence. And she's a member of the World Beyond War's Advisory Board. She's made 20 trips to Afghanistan as a guest of the Afghan Peace Volunteers. And I will just mention that I do have my border-free Afghan Peace Volunteer scarf. She has lived with Afghan people in the working classes of the neighborhoods of Kabul. She is, as we all know, a tremendous speaker, a tremendous writer, and a tremendous champion for peace and social justice throughout the world. Kathy, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of the organizers with World Beyond War. Arash, I want to thank you very much for a stirring opening and bringing us many, many questions, and also bringing us the voice of Akhtar. You know, the idea that embedded behind his eye, in his body, are the remnants of bombs that quite possibly were manufactured here in the United States by people who may never, ever learn to care about Akhtar, is a pretty compelling way to help us move into this discussion. In preparation, I also, I feel as though I befriended, although I've never met, a professor who was born in Afghanistan. He spent 4 decades teaching at the Lewis and Clark College in Portland. But during those decades, Dr. Zahar Wahab felt that he should go back to his country. And so he went back many, many times. Every year he'd go and he'd contribute after 2001 to building an education department. But then for 6 years, the most recent 6 years, he lived in Kabul. He taught at the American University in Kabul. But then in October of last year, he and his wife he said it was like he was on lockdown long before COVID hit, because you couldn't leave the university unless you were in an armored car. Life was so confining. And I guess I've actually been to Afghanistan about 30 times. And in the more recent visits, I also, no, Anne, that wasn't your fault. That's exactly what I sent you. I forgot to update it. But, you know, we certainly have had that experience of getting there, going to the Peace Center with the Afghan Peace Volunteers, and then not leaving till we go to the airport. Whereas before, there was much more freedom. Kabul is increasingly an unlivable city. Now, why is the United States responsible massively for havoc and unlivable conditions in Afghanistan? What has war brought? And I think what Zahar Wahab wanted us to understand is that what the United States has injected and developed within Afghanistan is a series of interacting realities, the warlords, certainly. Now, when we think about warlords, there are at least 18 insurgent groups. There are the Taliban, and then the most well-heeled and the most menacing of all the warlords is the United States. Recall, please, with me, the massive ordnance air blast bomb that Trump used. We don't even know why. It should have been labeled a war crime, but the United States warlords are so powerful, nobody can go after the United States very easily, even though war crimes have been committed by CIA trained death squads, by special operations forces, by the 7,000 bombings just this year that hit civilians. Again and again, the drone warfare. Think about the pine nut harvesters in Nangarhar near Jalalabad, who in a little over a year ago, they were just trying to harvest the pine nuts, and a drone operator fired a missile right into their midst and killed 32, and 40 were severely injured. And what kind of health care could people get out in the remote provinces? So the warlordism includes warlords who become very powerful, even so powerful they can make their own prison systems. They have enormous access to resources because they figured out how more or less to game the system and get the United States, working for them in many cases. And these warlords have had, some of them, horrible reputations for having done terribly frightening and devastating things. And the Ashraf Ghani's government has incorporated the warlords into the government because that's the only way they can survive. Now, along with all the warlords, you also have mafias. Now, that's a tough word to use. And mafia designates people who get control over resources, and they use threat and force to maintain that control. There are the mafias over land, mafias for minerals, mafias for foreign aid, mafias who gain control over access. There are many, many different mafiosos, if you will, who have tremendous power and help to make Afghanistan an unlivable place. Then you've got 18 other insurgent groups, armed opposition, United States forces, NATO forces, CIA-trained death squads, and people are trapped. They're caught in between all of these different warring groups, and the majority of the people in Afghanistan, the women and children, are often not only caught, they're stuck. Sometimes the men can run, they can hide, but the women and children often have nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, and now increasingly no food to eat. The food insecurity all across Afghanistan has shot up in alarming ways. What kinds of jobs are available? Jobs with the Afghan local police, with the Afghan National Security Defense Forces, jobs with some kind of work connected to NATO forces or US forces, jobs that involve picking up guns, risking your life, killing other people. The country has become devastated by all of these years of war. And how will they ever rehabilitate the agricultural industry when on top of all this, there's the drug industry that now involves $7 to $8 billion this year, but that translates on the international scene to maybe $80 billion. And the opium industry is thriving in Afghanistan today. Then you have somebody like Akhtar, who says, we have lost so much and gained nothing at all. Well, Jens Stoltenberg of NATO was quoted in mainstream media in the United States yesterday saying, oh, no, don't make a hasty withdrawal. We, amongst NATO countries, have invested too much to accept a hasty withdrawal. But let's think a little bit. What do Canada, Finland, Poland, New Zealand, Australia, with this sordid, terrible news that's just come out, what do those countries, Jordan, for instance, really have invested? What's their purpose in being so invested in Afghanistan? What do they want? Do they want to protect the Afghan people all that badly? Or does it turn out that when you become part of one of these forces in another country, well, you have to have people who provide food and weapons and transportation and housing, and you get a lot of different corporations who become part of that investment. And then if you hastily start to take it down, you're going to have some corporate profiteers pretty angry at you, because that's who mainly benefits from the war profiteers, and the carnage can be very profitable. And so we heard Jens Stoltenberg in 2014 say, oh, no, don't leave. We have to protect the women and children. NATO is there to protect the women and children. Well, have the women and the children who are hungry and cold and displaced and widowed and bereaved and orphaned, have they been helped? How much does Jens Stoltenberg care? How much do the US generals care about people in Afghanistan? And if they care so much, then let them immediately put a lot of work into demining and cleaning up the bombs and the weapons that have been dropped all over that country. If they care so much, let them figure out right now how to start up a multilateral trust fund, a multi-nation trust fund. And with all the billions that have been spent on the futile and the cruel war, put equivalent billions into a trust fund to rebuild Afghanistan, and make sure that that trust fund is never entrusted to the NATO forces or the US forces who have so badly misspent the resources so far. Do you know John Sopko, the head of the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, back when the Afghanistan papers were the big deal in the Washington Post and the New York Times as the breaking news, John Sopko said never had he ever expected to be so astounded by the hubris, the mendacity, the distortion, and the lies that characterized his experience of the United States military and civilians in Afghanistan, as well as Afghan civilians and military working with the United States. His reports are filed quadrennially, 4 times a year. Any congressperson, any senator could read them. Our president, who, by the way, told John Bolton that he thought Hamid Karzai was the president for the last 5 years of Afghanistan. He didn't even know who the president was. He didn't know Ashraf Ghani has been the president for the last 5 years. I highly doubt President Trump cares about people in Afghanistan. He doesn't care. But he wants an electioneering of a political plus to fall in his lap. But anyway, when he saw even just a portion, a tiny portion of one of the CIGAR reports, he said it should be locked up. Don't let anybody see that stuff. It'll be embarrassing for the United States. Embarrassing. We've wreaked havoc all across Afghanistan. We've made it unlivable. But let me close by saying there is one group that can travel in Afghanistan, just about anywhere. And they never, ever have armored accompaniment. You know what they have on their vehicles? It looks like the Euro symbol almost, but it's an E with a circle around it. And everybody knows that's the emergency surgical centers for victims of war vehicle. Don't attack it. They're never attacked. Why? I believe it's because they never ask any person who needs to be stitched up or operated on, what's your religion, or what's your ethnic background, or what's your political persuasion. They treat people as human beings. They treat people fairly. They've offered something good and needed without trying to make a profit. And that's where you find security. And that's where the United States could find security. You know, the war on terror has actually occasioned more terrorist actions than ever, every single year. But this professor that I'm so impressed with, Dr. Zahar Wahab, he actually, in a kindly way, said, sadly, in the United States, some of these mafias are gaining more control. Some of these groups that want to sell weapons and use weapons and can't be controlled by the government because they have so much power. He didn't name them, but I would name them: Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Electric, Boeing. So let's not let the warlords have the upper hand any longer. We are responsible, but we can take a cue from the people at Emergency and ask ourselves, how can we learn to live together without killing one another, and begin by saying we refuse to kill and maim and brutalize and torture Afghans, and that we want to see the chapter turned, yes, to a peacekeeping presence, maybe even, it's hard for me as a pacifist persuaded person to say, maybe even a peacekeeping force, but not comprised of the NATO countries or Western countries. Let the UN design another kind of presence to help Afghanistan truly turn a corner and be rid of all the warlords, especially the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. The U.S. has spent $2 trillion, 130 $3 billion on economic development, and you look at what Afghanistan is and where the money has gone into the economic warlords, an enormous amount has gone there. We thank you very much, Kathy, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions for you. The next speaker is Matt Ho. Matt has 12 years of experience in the US wars overseas with the Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. He is now a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, Matt resigned his State Department post in Afghanistan in protest over the US escalation of the war. When he was not deployed, he worked on the Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and the State Department from 2002 to 2008. Matt is a member of the board of directors for the Institute for Public Accuracy. He's an advisory board member for Expose Facts and the North Carolina Committee to Investigate Torture, also a member of Veterans for Peace and World Beyond War. Matt, please.
Thank you, Ann. I'm also wearing my Border Free scarf as well. I want to thank everyone for joining, and thank you to Vets for Peace in New York City and World Beyond War for putting us on, especially to Greta Zarro, who is always behind the scenes at World Beyond War, making all this happen. Tomorrow, as Ann spoke about earlier, tomorrow there'll be a hearing, one of, I don't know how many we have had on Capitol Hill about the war in Afghanistan. And it will once again repeat many of the same lies that sustain this war. I'm going to talk briefly about some of those lies, but I also want to set the stage for that with the members of Congress do not receive information on the war except from what the staff gives it to and from whatever cable news channels they happen to watch. So they know about the Afghan war based upon what Rachel Maddow is telling them, or what Sean Hannity is telling them, or what Tucker Carlson is telling them. And then when they have these hearings, the people who come in and testify in the hearings are hand selected by the staff director of the relevant committee, by his people. So these are people that are very familiar with the establishment. They're almost always are supportive of whatever view the ranking members of that committee want to have told. So whatever evidence they want to have explained to them is the evidence they're going to get, in terms of the bias or what the opinion will be. On top of that, within the congressional offices themselves, and I've heard this from multiple members of staff in congressional offices, about 70% of the time, members of Congress receive briefings on the wars, whichever war it is. Take your pick. From Western Africa to Pakistan, we have more than 15 different wars going on right now that this country is involved in, where we have young people killing other people and being killed themselves. And in 70% of those cases where someone comes in and briefs the Congress member or their staff about those wars, they are being briefed by think tanks that are funded by the defense industry. So they're not even being briefed by the Pentagon or the CIA or the State Department. They're being briefed by organizations whose very survival, whose ability to pay their rent depends upon donations from the weapons industry, as well as also donations directly from the US government, because the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, et cetera, fund a lot of these think tanks. And so you'd see that tomorrow where two of the members, Dr. Stephen Biddle and Dr. Seth Jones, who are both members of think tanks, both of those think tanks receive a good amount of Defense Department dollars or State Department dollars, as well as substantial amounts of money from the weapons industry. So that's where members of Congress get their information from. And what gets repeated to them over and over again are the same lies, the same myths, the same narratives. One of the things you'll hear, and Arash did a really good job of this. Arash, earlier kept saying the war began in the 70s. For the Afghans, this is a war of over 4 decades. It's absolutely, that is the case. Tomorrow in their hearing, you will only hear the war began on September 11th. You know, with casualty figures, you'll be told, well, you know, we've had more than 1 million service members go to Afghanistan. We've only had about 2,000 killed. That's not really that bad. The reality is that for Afghanistan, and you really can't divorce it from Iraq, but for Afghanistan, the number of Americans killed in Afghanistan is well over 10,000. When you add into private contractors to the soldiers killed, and then you add into the numbers killed by suicide, the number is well over 10,000. When you put that together with the Iraq war, because again, those two wars are very inseparable, the amount killed, Americans killed in these wars is more than 25,000. More than 20,000 have been wounded, which again, in Afghanistan, which again doesn't sound like a lot. But when you look at the total numbers of veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars who have been permanently disabled by traumatic brain injury, there's more than 500,000 of them. And for PTSD, there's more than 500,000 veterans from these wars who are disabled by PTSD. Some of that overlaps with the TBI veterans, some of it doesn't. And so for each of those, you have families that have been absolutely wrecked by these wars, and for which it doesn't end and will never end. And of course, this pales in comparison to what the Afghans have gone through. The numbers for casualties on the Afghans are unknowable. And it goes back all the way to the 1970s. You know, before the Soviet Union enters the war in December of 79, almost 100,000 people have already been killed in the fighting in Afghanistan. In the earliest days of the US invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, 2001, 2002, if you look at the work done by Jonathan Steele, who's a British reporter, in his book Ghosts of Afghanistan, which I recommend to everybody, he very clearly lays out that at least 100,000 Afghans were killed in the first months of the war, in 2001, 2002. I mean, so those are just two examples where right there, you've got more than 200,000 dead Afghans just for a period of months. And that doesn't even include the massive fighting. You know, one of the problems with understanding how many Afghans have been killed or wounded is because so much of the fighting takes place in the rural communities, in the rural villages, where people don't bring their dead and wounded to the government. Nobody is out there counting them. And I'm sure Danny and Rory have opinions on this as well too, but I would say that for every incident where we reported killing Afghans or Iraqis for that matter, and it got picked up by the US press and international press, there are at least 5 or 6 other incidents where it was never reported. No one ever counted it. So what we've done to the Afghan people is horrid. And then of course the refugee situation, where I think Afghans are now the largest refugee group in the world again, because so many Syrians have gone back home. So, you know, these are things that you just do not hear talked about in their entirety. You hear these numbers that have no basis in reality, or the body counts, as they're called, are all so suspect because they're so conservative, or they've been approved by official bodies that are linked, of course, to the war. You know, and there are a whole bunch of other things that I could get into in terms of the lies of it. What I would recommend, though, is for people to go and look back. It was almost a year ago next month, the Washington Post came out with the Afghan Papers, which is thousands of pages of, including the 3 men who are testifying tomorrow. Even though their names weren't released, I guarantee you they have remarks in those Afghan papers. The Washington Post, from my understanding, is still trying to get all the names released for the people who are involved in those Afghan papers. But it's very clear, like all the other wars the United States has been in, you know, just in the last 20 years, say, things that are happening in, you know, Iraq, Libya, Syria, the wars across Africa. I mean, you had the senior general, and it's something that hardly ever got reported on. You know, Nick Turse interviewed the senior American general for special operations in Africa. And he said to Vice News that American troops were killed and wounded in Africa, and they managed to keep it quiet. No one ever found out. So the lying is just all pervasive throughout American warfare. But again, go back and look at the Afghan papers. Go and look, as Ann and Kathy brought up, the SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction reports. And then, of course, look at the writings that David Swanson has done with World Beyond War, or Danny Sjursen or Rory Fanning have done. And then for me, you know, I've got a few pieces on Counterpunch you can go and look at, including one from February 2018, where it's about 8,000 words, but it kind of goes point by point and all the different lies, you know, about this war that sustains it. So, you know, I'll leave it at that, you know, because you'll hear a lot about hard-won gains. You'll hear a lot about all the schools we built. We hear a lot about the healthcare that we provided. And it's all bullshit, you know. And as my friend Tariq Koff says, you know, the obscenity in that is what we've done in Afghanistan, not in the word bullshit. You know, so go back and look at it and then try and inform as best you can others about the reality of the war there. Because so many people are treading along with this narrative of the war, the myths of the war, and the outright lies. And that's what it enables it to continue to go forward. But thank you all.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. And for those much more accurate figures on the numbers of deaths of Afghans, of US, and reminding that the costs of war go on for a long, long time. And for the families of those who have had people that have been killed or injured in these endless wars. Thank you very much, Matt. Our next speaker is Danny Sjursen. He's a retired US Army officer. He's a contributing editor of antiwar.com and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and a director of the new Eisenhower Media Network. He did combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan and later taught history at West Point. He's the author of a memoir and critical analysis of the Iraq War called Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, and also author of Patriotic Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War. Along with a fellow vet, Chris Henry Hendrickson, he co-hosts the podcast Fortress on a Hill. Danny?
Well, thank you so much, Anne, for the introduction, and for the whole group for having me. I'm frankly kind of honored and humbled by the other panelists, some of whom I've worked with extensively and some of whom, you know, I've admired from afar. So we've all kind of taken up different themes. And I think that that's one of the values of a panel. And for me tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about transition, right? Transition moments. In this case, the transition to a Biden administration, the fourth administration to oversee a war in its 20th year. And I'm going to talk about bipartisan imperialism, right? And a movie I think we've seen before, this transition from a rather unsavory Republican in many circles to a new Democratic administration. So starting off with my experience, I don't need to go into my full bio and background, but I will tell you that I was a New Yorker from Staten Island, which is sort of the land of police and firefighters. And so 9/11 it hit home pretty hard. And I was a freshman at West Point, a plebe, and I was very angry and toxically masculine and 18 years and 1 month old. And I couldn't wait to get in the war. Man, I couldn't wait to invade Afghanistan. In fact, my biggest fear was I'd miss it. The war would be over too fast. It'd be like the Persian Gulf War, 100 hours. So that didn't happen. I didn't miss the Afghan war. And interestingly, though, my first war wasn't Afghanistan. I went sort of out of order, just like most of the soldiers of my generation. And I ended up in Iraq, all right? So we all understand the obscenity of that. But the thing about this transition piece that does play to my personal story and then more is that I was in the Iraq Surge. And it broke me. I mean, I was against that war within a month. And I fell for the notion that there was this new candidate. His name was Barack Obama, and he would make sure that no one else would go through another Iraq surge. In fact, he was the salvation. And I was on that train. I was on that train big time. And when I was at Fort Knox, Kentucky, after the Iraq surge and before I found my way to Afghanistan, I would throw on a hoodie on the weekends and canvass for him in southern Indiana. Well, all that hope was kind of pretty quickly deflated. Soon after that, I was on my second surge. Instead of Baghdad, it was Kandahar. It was 2011, sort of the second half height of the Afghan surge. In fact, I was there in command of an outpost in Pashmul, about 3 miles vaguely in Kandahar from the village that Mullah Omar was from. We were on the Taliban's sort of home turf. And a Reuters reporter was sent down by brigade to do a profile on me. I guess they were looking for a New Yorker, to ask how he felt about the 9/11 attacks. The ostensible explanation for 10 years of war. Seems quaint, 10 years in our 20th year. Even a cynical captain that I was then would not have expected to be having this conversation. The Reuters reporter asked me what I thought about things, and I told him. I had very few F's left to give even then. And it angered my bosses. I had said things like, this has nothing to do with 9/11, that I don't see a connection, that the people I'm fighting and that are fighting me and that are dying in the crossfire, my own crimes, they don't have anything to do with 9/11, that this isn't that. I said, how can you be all that angry with, teenage farm boys? And certainly I wasn't a fan of the doctrinaire Taliban, but well, that wasn't so popular with my bosses. What was popular was when the generals would all come down and visit the new Afghan local police that I started forming in my area. So I'd take them on little Potemkin patrols and let them pretend they were in combat. And boy, did I get a lot of gold stars for that. Now, nobody much liked the interview about 9/11 where I told the truth. So anyway, I'm not an expert on Afghanistan. I spent a year there, basically under siege in a small outpost, I was an armed tourist, a voyeur, right, to a certain extent. Water carrier for empire for far too long. So I'm not an expert, but I did get enough of a window and a motivation to care and a motivation to study. What struck me about that transition, and it was kind of my second broken heart, the first one having been finding out that my life's work and identity was a lie in Iraq and again in Afghanistan. It was knowing that this urbane, this genteel, this better alternative to Bush, it was his administration, right? It was his administration with a lot of the folks that are coming in with the Biden administration that pushed that second surge. That's who sent me on that surge. And at first I was really angry, and I'll probably still never forgive or forget that. But at the same time, it was instructive. It was kind of a lesson and strategic. What was that lesson? I think it was that we have polite emperors and we have coarse emperors. And sometimes we have buffoonish emperors. But we get emperors. And, it was easy to be angry at first. 3 of my soldiers in a troop of 82 had been killed. One committed suicide later who had been shot in the face and wounded and disfigured. 30 others were wounded. And there's one triple amputee in that group. That's like 40% casualty rate. That's pretty high, right? That's pretty high. But you know what? Countless Afghans. I say countless not as hyperbole, but because we didn't count. And the amount of airstrikes that I called. I remember on one of our last days in Afghanistan, there was a guy who'd been sniping at our towers, and finally we set up a little trap for him, and one of our snipers took this person's head off on the cameras of our base, and we watched and we cheered and we high-fived, and then we wondered who we'd become. I left Afghanistan shortly after that. Anyway, I thought to myself, never again. No salvation from the top. No discrete party will save me or figure. And so I think this is a cautionary tale as we look at what's happening now. A warning and my own fear. And I think a fear for this republic. what's, sort of left of that aspiration. And it's an Obama dormancy encore, as I've been calling it. Now, the people who are on this call, I think there's 290 people, right? It's a pretty darn good crowd. I think everyone on here speaks a lot. I'm used to speaking to 8 people sometimes, and I'm pleased. That's a lot of folks. And but yet I don't think the Obama dormancy that I'm describing, the dormancy of an anti-war movement, the dormancy of a movement for peace, applies to these folks. There were always folks active, but a lot of folks who had acted as though, look, I'm anti-war. They were really anti-Bush, weren't they? They were really anti-Bush, and maybe they were anti-Iraq war. But when Obama said it was a good war in Afghanistan, well, they jumped right on board, and it became impolite. It wasn't done, as Orwell said about the media in his proposed preface to Animal Farm that didn't get published. He said, it's not that you're not allowed to say these things officially, it's just not done. It's a self-censorship. I'm seeing some bad signals on this already, and I'm going to talk about 3 headlines that tell me that. We have a status quo squad that's coming in to do the transition in the Biden administration. I don't think that Trump was really an anti-war candidate. I don't think he really believed in much of anything at all. So don't misunderstand me. There are some folks when I say this who think I have a secret MAGA hat in my bedroom. I don't. Mostly it's just New York sports teams. But who's coming in? Well, the archetype is a Clinton and Obama retread. These are architects and the complicit in the Afghan surge, in the extension of drone warfare, Libya, Syria. We're not even going to get into all that, but that was their policy record. But who else are they? Well, the archetype, if you pull the black ball of a Biden transition team member on these issues out of the bag, the archetype was Ivy League graduate who went to work on a congressional foreign relations staff, who then had a mid-level job in the Obama National Security Council, after which, when a job in the Hillary Clinton administration didn't pan out because of, Russia, apparently. But when, I'm being facetious, but when that didn't happen, then what'd they do? Well, they did 2 things. They went to strategic consulting firms that some of them founded, at which point they bridged the Silicon Valley hipster with the Pentagon suit wearer and did it profitably. And they went to work for CNAS and CSIS. And they have really wonderful names and excellent acronyms. But what we also know is that they are funded to the tune, the top 50 think tanks over the last 5 years, of $1 billion. $1 billion. One of those think tanks, the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, was funded by 10 discrete, either US military agencies or war profiteers. That's who they are. And I think we're going to be coming to a moment here where we're going to find out about folks. We're going to find out where their hearts are and where their heads are. This is going to become sort of a litmus test, and I hate that word. But there are rare times, I think, where we're going to find out where this movement's going and who's with us. I want to say something about not only the Biden transition, but the generals. The generals have an enormous amount of influence on whether we stay or go in Afghanistan, don't they? I think that's kind of fascinating. One of them, General Lute, said that we didn't have the faintest idea what we were doing in Afghanistan. Afghan papers, Washington Post, a year ago. General Lute used to teach social sciences at West Point. You know who his prize student was that he gave the highest plaudits to? You might have heard of him, Mike Pompeo. Well, Kathy made a point about these generals. Do they really care? Well, I think she raised an excellent point by saying they were just the strongest warlords in the room. And warlords who got to sleep soundly at night. They didn't have to worry about getting assassinated. They had more bodyguards than any mafia had in the group. So where are they now? Well, we know where those warlords are now. They're gun running for the defense industry, and they're consulting governments on what to buy and sell. And they're at the think tanks that are the urbane sophisticates justifying the whole thing. And I think the point here is they don't care. They don't. Afghanistan, the sad reality, has generally been a political football domestically, and it's not about Afghans. None of this is. None of these headlines. So what headlines am I talking about as I close out? Stars and Stripes a few weeks ago. Years after they fought in Afghanistan, troops watched their children deploy to the same war. Well, that's never happened before, except maybe the Native American wars of genocide. That's interesting. That's kind of grotesque, isn't it? Wait for it, though. An American soldier is going to be killed who was born after 9/11. That's going to be pretty rough for the Republic. I don't know if you come back from that. Of course, a whole lot of Afghans have been killed, countless, that word comes up again, who were born after 9/11. Doesn't really make it into the conversation. The New Yorker today ran a headline from one of their experts on the Middle East, one of their top people who knows the region, right? Especially Lebanon, supposedly. And her headline said something to the effect of a lame duck president prematurely withdraws from Afghanistan in order to sabotage Biden. You know, I don't for a second think that Trump's doing much of this on principle, but that's an interesting headline. It does stretch the language a bit when premature is applied to a 20-year war. That being said, I do agree with kind of the first comments tonight that there is a obligation of the United States to Afghanistan. I don't think it's a troop obligation, but I'll end on this point. You know, let's tell the truth about the Afghan war, that it was about vengeance, geopolitics, and hegemony before 9/11. Before 9/11, when Brzezinski, the national security advisor, convinced Carter to start supporting what became sort of the Taliban before the Russians invaded, so we could get them to invade. Look, this was never about democracy or women or minority rights. It's a zombie war. I wrote an article on the 47th Seagar report that Kathy mentioned the other day. This is a strategic dead man walking. The only people who don't know that it's a strategic dead man walking yet are the future dead. They don't know this war is over because it continues. So it's time for heads and hearts on this. I think the head has to admit an inconvenient truth. The US military was never a force for good in Afghanistan or the world. And the heart has to say that real care for victims involves two things: reparations, both at home and abroad, for the various groups that have been victimized, and an utter change of the paradigm and the posture of the US foreign policy abroad. And I agree with Kathy. If we think that NATO armed voyeurs like myself are the solution, then man, that delusion runs deep. But I'm glad to be here having this conversation. I'm sad we have to, but there's no better group to have it. And thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. A lot of food for thought there, and a lot of articles that you've written and books, and there's a lot of information out there that we can be using as we tell our Congress people what we think ought to happen with this Afghanistan war. Our next panelist, and the last one, and then we'll have Q&A after that, is Rory Fanning. Rory went through 2 deployments in Afghanistan with the 2nd Ranger Battalion and became one of the first US Army Rangers to resist the Iraq War and the global war on terror. In 2008 and 2009, he walked across the United States for the Pat Tillman Foundation. And you remember Pat was one of the Rangers that was murdered in Afghanistan. In 2000, Roy is the author of Worth Fighting For, an Army Ranger's Journey Out of the Military and Across America. In 2015, he was awarded a grant from the Chicago Teachers Union to speak to public school students about the endless US wars and about aspects of serving in the military that recruiters fail to mention. Roy?
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody on this panel. Like Danny said, it's truly an honor to be with you tonight. Thanks to World Beyond War, Veterans for Peace New York chapter. And again, thanks to all the panelists. Tonight, as the last speaker, I'd like to talk a little bit about resistance. You know, oftentimes I leave talks like this wondering, you know, what do I do next? And when I talk about resistance, there's lots of forms of resistance, as you all know. You know, attending this meeting and sharing the link with your friends is a form of resistance. Supporting groups like World Beyond War, Code Pink, Afghan Diaspora for Equity and Progress, Voices for Creative Nonviolence, Veterans for Peace. You know, these are all groups and, you know, forms of resistance when you're participating and active in them. Tonight, I'll talk a little bit about the form of resistance that, you know, is best for me. It works best for me. And when I talk about resistance, I'm really just talking about what I do to help myself sleep at night. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about why I joined the military, you know, what I saw when I was in the military, and why I became a war resister after really one tour in Afghanistan. I ended up going back to Afghanistan unarmed on my second tour. So yeah, I mean, like Danny, you know, I was, I don't know, what's the word? When you see the two planes hit the Twin Towers and you're young and you see all those thousands of people die and you're full of energy and you got a bunch of student loans to pay back and you don't want to go work in a cubicle and you've just seen the movie Black Hawk Down and you've grown up, you know, in a right-wing Catholic family that believes that the US is a force for freedom and democracy around the world. I mean, signing up for the military was an obvious choice. I wanted to be like those guys in Black Hawk Down. You know, but I kind of had a sense when you sign up for the military, you're less of a person and you're more of a piece of equipment. So I wanted to become the most expensive piece of equipment as quickly as possible. And, you know, joining an entry-level special forces unit like the Ranger Battalion was the way I chose to sign up. You know, I went through about, you know, a few months of training. Training was a lot of food and sleep deprivation, you know. And before I knew it, you know, I found myself in Afghanistan. And I was expecting bullets to be whizzing by my head when I landed in the country. It was a few days after Christmas in 2002 when I landed. And the next morning I woke up to relative quiet. I saw gaping holes in the sides of building in downtown Kabul. I saw little children pushing carts of rotten fruit down the streets of the main thoroughfare in Kabul. I saw unbelievable amounts of poverty and devastation. You know, Afghanistan was invaded by, was occupied by the Soviets in the late 70s, early 80s. And after that, they were embroiled in a civil war. Then the US began its occupation. There's no hope for cubicle jobs over there. I mean, it's just poverty. It's pure poverty. And like I said, I signed up hoping to prevent another 9/11, to do my best to make sure that didn't happen again. But after a few missions, you know, where we were sent out, you know, really rooted in, you know, and this wasn't just, you know, a once in a while type thing. Most of the missions we went on were rooted in horrible intelligence. We knew next to nothing about the culture. You know, none of us obviously spoke the language. We had a few interpreters. But we were there just like Danny said, you know, to seek revenge for 9/11. We didn't really care who we took revenge on. We just wanted revenge. And I don't think the politicians back home really cared who we were going after. And we often found ourselves as little more than pawns in village disputes. You know, when you live in such a poor country, you know, and someone says, hey, show me where the Taliban is, or show me where the terrorists are. So show me the people who took down those Twin Towers. People are going to point, oh, go get that guy over there. And we go in, we land in someone's front yard, storm into their house in the middle of the night, hearing little kids scream, throw a bag over some military age man and send him off to a place like Guantanamo or whatever. And then we maybe find out a little bit later, oh, that guy actually owed some rent to a landlord. And, you know, we would have rockets land in our camp. And, you know, Akhtar, you know, he was on the receiving end of those retaliations because we would just call in a military airstrike, a 500-pound bomb. You know, where did that rocket come from? Or where did it come? I don't know, maybe that general vicinity over there. And so we would drop a 500-pound bomb in that general vicinity over there. You know, some estimates, you know, like we said, we can't count, we're not counting the dead in Afghanistan. But by some estimates, there's as much as 80% of the people that have died since 2001 have been innocent civilians. There's a really great professor, I think, Professor Robert Pate from the University of Chicago. He is a political scientist and is the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism. He noted that between 1980 and 2001, there were about 321 suicide bombs around the world, with only 10% aimed at the US and US interests. Between 2001 and 2015, there were close to 3,000 suicide bombs around the world. 90% were aimed at the US or US interests. So I wasn't in Afghanistan making the world safer. And the numbers certainly bear that out. I certainly wasn't making it safer for the hundreds of thousands of Afghans that have lost their lives since 2001. I was just creating more devastation. So I decided that I had to become a war resister. And it was, I won't go through all that, but it wasn't necessarily an easy process, but it was one of the most rewarding things that I've ever done, is leaving the military. And I, was supported by a few really great people like Pat Tillman and his brother Kevin, who themselves said they would be doing something similar, if they weren't in the situations that they were in. They were in the front yard when Jessica Lynch, which is basically the commercial for the Iraq War, went wrong, and they saw how fake all that was. They too were disillusioned. And there was a lot of disillusioned veterans. Between 2001 and 2012, I don't know the numbers after 2012, but there's been at least 50,000 war resistors, veterans who bought into the movies, bought into the video games, and said, no, I want no part of that. And so what I do, my form of resistance, which took me a long time to work my way up to, because it's certainly not easy, but I realized that the only way I was going to be halfway sane was to go in and talk to young people about what the US is doing around the world, talking to high schools, talking to universities, talking to prisons when I can. And it is not easy getting in front of these kids. Every administrator in all of these schools sees the military as nothing but a positive thing. It's a form of structure. It's a way, particularly in places like the South and West, sides of Chicago, which has the highest recruitment level, of any school district in the country. By recruitment level, I mean JROTC students, people who are being trained to join the military from a high school age. And these kids can tell you very little, absolutely, actually hardly anything about the last 15 years, much less the last 100 years of US imperialism, the Afghan War, the Iraq War, Vietnam, North Korea. They can't tell you very little. And so if we're going to ask these kids to go off and kill and die so a fraction of population can benefit from this, while all of us suffer, I think these kids should have a degree of full disclosure. And I try not to go in there and I don't wag my hand, finger and say, don't join the military, because a lot of these kids just don't have the options, and so, this is their way for college. And it's the way to get their college paid for. And I always like to say, one of the best things you can do to fight U.S. imperialism is advocate for free education. Advocate for free healthcare. One of the best things you can do to fight climate change is challenge U.S. imperialism. U.S. military is the largest polluter on the planet. But anyway, all is to say is, and I'm running out of time, so I'll just wrap it up here. When kids ask me, is the U.S., is the military like, Call of Duty, the popular first-person shooter game? And, I ask them, do you hear babies screaming, in Call of Duty? Well, not really. Are the majority of the people that die in Call of Duty innocent civilians? Like, not really, no, none. Can you turn off Call of Duty? Like, yeah, absolutely. It's like, well, you can't turn off the war. And so I'd urge people, if they have the bandwidth, the capacity, the feeling, try to get in and talk to these students. You can't keep 800 military bases around the world open if there aren't students and young people filling those positions. You can't slaughter hundreds of thousands of people around the world if there aren't young people squeezing the trigger. So, sharing the information you learned in this panel, in this discussion, all great things you can do. Get in front of young people, all great things you can do. Again, thanks to everybody for having me on. This panel was amazing, and the questions in the comment section are incredible. So we'll leave the last 15 minutes to that.
Thank you very much, Rory. Those are important things for us to remember, that the military will collapse if there's nobody joining up. And so trying to work with our own families and communities to alert these young people that there are other things, and particularly in economic times of distress, like right now, where there are very few jobs, the military is out there lurking and ready to snap up anyone that'll walk in through those doors. Thank you again. And thanks to all 5 of our panelists for your remarkable statements and your lives and telling us about these. I'd like to ask another remarkable person, David Swanson, who is just an incredible writer and speaker, and he's going to moderate the questions and answers. So David, would you like to ask our panelists one of the questions that come in from the audience?
Thanks, Anna. I have 14 minutes and I have an interview, and I hope you all will continue for a couple of hours because it will take that to get through these questions, and I hope I can come back and watch it. I'll text you and through the chat questions that we don't get to. I'll mention just off the top that several people would like Matt to name 15 conflicts currently underway. I think rather than trying to think them up and say them, if you could put that in the chat, Matt, or if you could send it to us, we will forward it to all attendees and anyone who missed, but apparently you made a reference to 15 combat areas and people would like to know what they are. Without taking time on that, if that's okay, I've tried to consolidate this into 12.
I'll send it to you guys.
Thanks, Matt. First question to whoever would like to take it, and this comes from multiple people, some of whom I think are on opposite sides of the question, but as long as the Taliban is going to be there, there's always an argument for the U.S. not leaving. So does the U.S. stay forever? How can Afghans find a solution for themselves as long as there are foreign troops there? And on the flip side of that, can the Kabul government stand on its own? What about Kathy's suggestion of a non-NATO US UN presence, armed, unarmed, whatever? And there was also a question, is this analogous to keeping an abusive spouse in a household? So General, what can be done now? Why not get every US troop and contractor out? Who'd like to take that?
I mean, I'm happy to start really quick. I'm always torn on these questions because, especially as the ex-soldier on the panel or one of a few, I think that there's the fear that by advocating as I do for immediate several yesterdays ago withdrawal, that you're leaving the people that you purport to care about to the wolves, and that it's just about saving a handful of American lives that are still being lost every year. But I do think that it goes beyond that. There are serious philosophical and just conceptual questions, which is, is it actually insanity to keep, doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result? The idea that any number of American troops, including 100,000 troops during, the second surge, the Afghan surge I was a part of, are going to measurably alter the ability of the Kabul government to stand on its own, I think has to count as a massive delusion. By every metric that the US military has, the Taliban is in a stronger position, and we failed on every metric up to and including corruption, forget all the military ones. We knew all of this by the SIGAR reports. I think we're up to our 48th now. That is until 2 years ago when we classified them all. So you're not allowed to know any longer how many Afghan soldiers are killed every month. You're not allowed to know all kinds of metrics, all of which were trending downward, ironically, right? Unsurprisingly, it's a better word. So I think the question becomes, when is it the right time? I mean, when is it the right time? I mean, no one ever mentions that. You notice that? Like, nobody in the bipartisan blob establishment mentions that. They never tell you what the gate is. It's very vague. It's these aren't the droids they're looking for. And there's not a whole, it's very squishy. And I'm just concerned that, folks are, I don't trust this outgoing president, of course, but the idea that we will have a measurable effect on the outcome in Kabul and across that country, whether it's a year from now or 10 years from now, has to stand as a great delusion. I say that with caution and with empathy, as paltry as that sounds, but I just think that if it is an abusive relationship, which I think it is, now is not the time, coming up on 42 years into the abusive marriage. Now is not the time for us to say, we're sorry, we're going to be better now. We're not going to hit you anymore. We've been the source of most of the ills in Afghanistan. And I think that we need to shift that paradigm, look at something like Kathy was mentioning, and really take a hard look at ourselves. So I don't think that you're ever going to hear from the establishment bipartisan consensus that it's the right time to leave. And that concerns me. So as much as I'm not happy with Trump's motivations potentially for this, I'm pretty desperate. So I'll take the nuclear option to remove US forces.
Some of these questions were to Arash. Arash, did you want to speak to that or not?
Yeah, I think there's a level of complexity. I'll try to my best ability to answer some of the questions. I think there's this laser focus on troops and troops alone, and that isn't the only problem in Afghanistan. We can talk about the National Directorate Service of Afghanistan, which is the Afghan version of the CIA or FBI or DHS, which is this covert force that is in Afghanistan and abusing and committing human rights violations. Then there's the, if any of you all have read the foreign policy report from earlier this week, more human rights abuses of a CIA-backed force, Afghan-led, but backed by the CIA that is not under the US military, that is acting with impunity, is committing all kinds of human rights violations, and is arresting Afghans who are speaking out publicly to foreign policy and other Western and Afghan media outlets. Then there's the empowerment of the warlords and the militias and the mafias that we've heard from other panelists. So while I do appreciate that there's this focus on getting the US troops out, there's so much multi-layered complexity to it. And I think I'll go back to what happened in the early 90s, which is walking away by itself is not a strategy that's going to be successful. And I understand that there's extremist forces in Afghanistan, and that will be used by by the way, this is an oddball coalition of folks. It's Mitch McConnell and Liz Cheney, and then probably all these moderate pro-war, pro-Northrop Grumman, pro-Raytheon Democrats. It's an oddball coalition. There's some folks who are anti-war. And they will continue to always use these phrases that I've been using and kind of abuse those phrases to say, hey, we're going to have to stay in Afghanistan for another 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I disagree with that notion. I think there's a way to do this in a way that reduces harm slowly, but still gets folks out. But I want to say that the US has pulled out once already out of Afghanistan. And what happened? It was a civil war. It was rockets raining down on Kabul. And I'm not simply, I think there's this complexity and nuance I have to bring because people really are frightened of what's going to come next in Afghanistan. People are really scared. And I will say people are sick and tired of all the violence and conflict and the corruption that they've seen, the abuses by the police, by the military, the violence committed by all sides in Afghanistan. They're sick and tired of it. And I think just abandonment by itself is not a strategy that works here. The US has to commit to supporting the Afghan people. And I think that's the conversation that has kind of been missing. People in Congress are speaking about so-and-so and national security and America's interest. Well, what about the Afghan interests? What about the Afghan people? And they haven't really been listened to in the past 20 or 40 years.
A question that relates to that maybe I can toss in before others jump in on that is, should the US pay reparations? How do we push for withdrawal and reparations? What would reparations look like? How would we be confident that money reaches the right hands? How do we stop the Democrats from opposing the withdrawal? And numerous other related questions. Someone else want to join in on those?
Well, the US government's never going to care about the Afghans. They never will. Just like they've never cared about anyone else around the world. So this idea that that somehow we're going to get the United States government to be involved in a benevolent way in Afghanistan, it's just, there's no evidence for that. There hasn't been. And the idea that the US, here's one of the myths about Afghanistan and the US. The US didn't walk away from Afghanistan when the Soviet Union left. The US, after the Soviet Union left, kept sending weapons to the Mujahideen for 3 years. The idea that we just picked up and left because the communists or the Soviets left is just not true. We continued to pump weapons into that country for years, did everything we could to, obstruct peace talks. And that's the conditions that led to the civil war that Arash was talking about. So there's, the United States never just leaves. And just as if we pull out the rest of the troops there, we're still going to have commando forces that don't fall under the agreement. We're still going to have a carrier a strike group located in the ocean. We're still going to have Air Force jets and bombers located in Diego Garcia and throughout the Persian Gulf. And the CIA is going to always do whatever it wants. So the idea that we're somehow going to leave, what's going to happen though is that, just as Arash mentioned, or maybe it was Arash, or maybe it was Danny, I forget, or Kathy, I can't remember who, that earlier this year, the administration cut off the $1 billion in funding for the Afghan government that is non-military, that was meant to try and provide some form of support. But what the US does, and I don't think there's ever been a backroom Kabul someplace where they have come up with this idea. I think this is it works on the subconscious level of American foreign policy, is that we build these house of cards so that US presence is impossible to remove. And this goes, across the board through a whole bunch of different ways, whether it be through the economic survival that supposedly is necessary for US troops to stay in places, whether it be because there's no way that corrupt government is going to stay in place if we aren't there keeping them in power or providing the funding, so it is very complicated. But the notion that the United States government is going to do anything in Afghanistan other than kill people is completely mistaken. The United States government has no interest. Any of the money we spent, the $130 billion that Ann brought up, and I can tell you this because I was involved directly with that money, none of that money was meant to help Afghans. It was meant to control the political and economic situation in Afghanistan, just like we did in Iraq, just like we're doing in 26 countries in Africa right now. We have a term the US military uses. It's money as a weapon system. Money is used the same way as our bombs or our bullets, as anything that would be what the US military calls kinetic. So that's one of the real dangers we have here, is this idea that the US government is capable, let alone willing, to do something different in Afghanistan. And I just don't see that's possible. So for me, the answer is, how do you do the least harm? Or at least for, in a sake as American citizens, what we're responsible and what we're able to affect and change, what can we do about it? And that's and again, it's a bigger issue to Afghanistan, because there are, from Western Africa to Pakistan, this is the plight of there are less countries where this suffering is occurring than there are not. And then plenty of others are under the yoke of US-controlled governments like Egypt, or US allied governments like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So it's a very complicated thing. But these house of cards, that's just part of what comes from these US military occupations. And so it has that effect of like, well, we can't pull out because it'll collapse. Well, of course it's going to collapse, because we're the only thing they're supporting it. And the way we're supporting is by killing lots of people and keeping in power these corrupt governments. And one more other thing, part of the development of the American armed forces, and something that I think people need to recognize, is that the US military for decades has been trying to get to a place where we don't have to have a lot of people on the ground. And I say we, and I know David hates it when I say we, but where the United States, because I know none of it is we here, but where the United States doesn't have to have mass amounts of forces on the ground. So, and you've seen that play out in the last decade, or really in the last 5 or 6 years, with the way the US conducted its operations, where we, in Iraq, where you use the proxy government forces there. In Afghanistan, where you use the proxy government forces. In Yemen, where you use various militia forces. In Syria, where you use militia forces or the Kurds. You know, and what you do then is you don't have American forces on the ground, with the exception of 500, 1,000, 2,000 advisors, and then you have American air power and firepower, and the rest is done by proxy forces. And this is something that the United States military has really been trying to get to for decades in the way it wages war. And so I think there are many in the Pentagon who are happy keeping the force at a level of 500 or 1,000 in Afghanistan, because they're still able to control the situation using proxy forces, which then turns to the real question is, you know, getting to the point of like, well, how do we actually help the Afghans? How do you actually end this war? How do you end this fighting? Certainly, I don't think anyone here believes pulling all U.S. forces out of the country is going to end the war. It's not. You know, the fighting's going to go on. How do you end that fighting? How do you bring about a peace is a real serious and hard question that, you know, I don't know how many people in Congress are actually talking about that.
Well, thank you, Matt. And, you know, as we've got quite a few questions here about contractors. You know, we have over 10,000 contractors there. Many of them are as well armed or better armed than our own military. Our military, the 4,500, are primarily instructors for the Afghan security force and the Afghan military. But we have U.S. defense contractors that are heavily weaponized and who guard military bases. Our own military doesn't guard our own military base usually. It's these armed contractors who are still part of the mix. And when you talk about why, I mean, here's something to ask the Congress people when you send in your Roots Action thing is, how much money did you get from those contractors that have made the $133 billion that on the contracts that have gone into Afghanistan? How many of your contractors are living in Doha and Dubai? Because we know the graft and corruption of all of that, the numbers of contracts that we've had for health, for education, for transportation, for you name it, and the U.S. has put so many contracts in there, and the majority of them didn't really benefit the people of Afghanistan. So as well as stories about the contractor issue, but also here's a question about, you know, the peace agreements or the peace talks that have been going on. First, the one that the U.S. did unilaterally with the Taliban, and now the one that is suspended between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Would any of you all like to make comments about that? And is it a hope for peace?
You know, I think when people ask, well, how can we abandon Afghanistan to the Taliban? It's very, very important to recognize that the person who is supposedly the peace negotiator, Khalilzad, only negotiated with the Taliban for close to 2 years. And after Ashraf Ghani started to say, well, we have to own some of this, how about us? Then they started to talk about inter-Afghan dialogue. But of course, Ashraf Ghani doesn't really own that government as much as the United States owns him. So I think we ought not presume that the United States foreign policy and military are deeply troubled by the Taliban.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments on the Taliban? Do you anticipate that the Taliban will be as brutal toward women and children as it was prior to the U.S. invasion and occupation of Afghanistan?
I think I can speak to that a little bit. I think there's a real fear because there are certain folks who are definitely on the front line, women being one of them, and minorities being on like one of the other groups that's predominantly on the front line, who are expecting and hearing from the Taliban and also experiencing from the Taliban this like brutal treatment that continues in some of the rural areas that they control. And so that's one of the fears. It's they are seeing the U.S. cut this side deal essentially and looping out the Afghan government and going through this pretty problematic process of not including Afghans, having this forthright deal with the Taliban that is cutting out the Afghan people, is cutting out the Afghan government, and that's what women are freeing. And just to bring it back to the point about contractors, I don't think there's like reliable data. I've heard numbers that 10,000, as such as and who mentioned that, and I've heard 22,000. There's no data that's available because it's all supposedly secret. And if there's one takeaway is like to ask folks in Congress for more transparency on how many contractors are there in Kabul and the rest of the country. How many of them are from the US? How many are from the UK? We don't have answers to these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with the contractors, Congressional Research Service has done some work on it, but like, Arash and Danny have said, now they're classifying all this information. The ratio got to 2.5 contractors for every service member. That was the last ratio I saw. So if you look at the way these wars progressed over the last 20 years in terms of troops on the ground, you've seen this ratio increase, where originally it was, I think in the early days of Iraq, it was half a contractor for every soldier in Iraq. And now it's just, because there's, as Mike Ferner says, and God, I love Mike, and I saw his comment earlier, even losing wars make money. So it is that there is so much money involved in all this, and you will see that, in a sense of who briefs like we were saying earlier, who briefs Congress, who, with regards to the Taliban, what we've done to the Afghan people is simply horrific. Look at the choices we've given them. It's like either stick with us, and I'm glad Arash brought up the NDS. Which is basically, as Arash said, it's the CIA, FBI, Homeland Security, all kind of put into one, but every element of the Afghan security forces, the NDS is probably the worst, but every element, the police, the army, whoever, they all torture as a matter of routine. That's the options you're giving the Afghan people. You're giving them, the Taliban or these people here. It is really sick and disgusting what we've done to the Afghan people on so many levels over 40 years. It's really disturbing that we are. And as you can see, who's got a good answer for this? I think I wish they had listened to a lot of you folks 20 years ago, or a lot of you folks 40 years ago about this.
Thank you. As we kind of close up our session here, I'd like to ask Tarek Koff, who had the idea for this webinar about a week ago and got everyone together. And Tarek, we thank you for your idea. And what would you have to say on this?
Well, I'm really grateful to all of you, to the panelists. You've spoken so not only eloquently, but you've spoken from your heart. Kathy, you just melted me. You've spoken from your heart, and you've spoken from the fact that you love life and that you love truth and that you have a sense for justice. So I think it's so important that we got together. I personally feel that the US has no business whatsoever in Afghanistan in any way, shape, or form. I feel we've done nothing. My awareness of it from the beginning, because I've been here for a while, is that we've done no good. We've done nothing. Maybe there's a tiny little bit of good that some Americans have done here and there that you could cite. But overall, it's such a small percentage compared to the harm and the evil and the destruction it's done. And it goes back to what we were saying, what some of you were saying back in the 70s, the support for the Taliban. And it was so cynical and it was so evil at that time, what we did, just to get at the Russians. So I think I would agree that the US has to get out, and I like what Kathy said, let there be a non-NATO international force. We don't trust NATO. If the Nazis were occupying my town, what do I want them to hang around for any reason at all? No, they've done nothing but harm. So we need some different help in Afghanistan. Anyway, that's all I want to say. Thank you, Anne, and thank you
very much, Tarek. And it's 4,500 people we're talking about. going down to 2,200. It's not like it's 100,000 people that are leaving. And we do hope that each one of you all will take the time to email your congressmen and women using the Roots Action petition. And it'll be interesting to listen to that Armed Services Committee hearing tomorrow. We want to thank, again, Tarek for organizing this, and Greta and David from World Beyond War for hosting this. And we want to thank all of you all. We still have 230 people. It's amazing, with 290 from the beginning. We had over 600 people that signed up for it, and I know that they will probably be wanting to watch it on YouTube. This has been recorded. And if any of you all want to save the chat, if you go into the chat room and over to the right, there are 3 little dots, and one of them is Save Chat. Hit that, and then it will come into your computer. So we want to thank everyone for your concern about what is going on in Afghanistan. We want to wish the people of Afghanistan the very best. Arash, please give everyone our best, and Kathy, everyone from the Afghan Peace Volunteers, give everyone our very best. And no more wars. Stop these endless wars. Bring our troops home, and that'd be really good for us to get done. It would.
And thank you so much, Ann.
So thank you. So we thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again on another webinar, of which there are plenty these days. So be good and be safe. Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you. Bye-bye. Good night.
Thanks, Greta. Thank you.
Thanks, Greta.
Thanks.
See everybody.